Welcome everybody to the second of our webinars on drug reform in Latin America, a series that really was sparked in this iteration, although we've done these before several years ago, by the current government of President Petro in Colombia, who has made drug reform one of the centerpieces of his presidency, and we've taken up the mantle and are exploring the possibilities, not just in Colombia, but elsewhere. Today's session is precisely to start to dig into the elsewhere part of drug reform in Latin America, points of convergence and otherwise, and we will explore why that's important and what is going on in those other countries. The standard housekeeping are always in effect. This is obviously on the record. If you have a question, we will take written questions, not spoken questions or verbal questions. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom, and we'll be pleased to try and entertain all of them, time permitting. We do make an effort to do that. Before I turn it over to Arjona, professor at Northwestern University, there's been a wonderful collaborator with us, as has been Rodrigues, a network throughout Latin America, to frame today's discussion and start the conversation. Let me just thank and introduce today's panelists. We have Angélica Durán-Martínez, who's an associate professor and director of global studies PhD program at the University of Massachusetts, Lowell. Thank you, Angélica, for joining us. Javier Osorio, who's assistant professor, School of Government and Public Policy at the University of Arizona, and also the founder of Academia para el Análisis de Seguridad. Welcome, Javier. Thank you for joining us today. And last but certainly not least, Thiago Rodrigues, who's a professor, Institute of Strategic Studies, Universidade Federal Fluminense, founder, Center for Interdisciplinary Studies of Psychoactives. Again, thank you to you, Thiago, for joining us from Brazil. We look forward to this conversation today. Before I forget, we will mention at the end, a video is being made of this event and will be available hopefully tonight or certainly no later than tomorrow for those of you who want to send it to your friends who may have to leave early or otherwise want to re-listen to things that have been said today. So with that, Ana, I'll turn it over to you. And again, thank you for being a co-presenter and a great collaborator on this series with us.
Thank you, Ken. Hi, everyone. And thank you to our panelists, good colleagues and friends. We are really looking forward to having this conversation. And let me just say a couple of words about the topic of today's seminar. So when we think about drug policy in Latin America, usually we have country-specific conversations. And a lot of the work that we do as scholars and a lot of the work our organizations do really focuses around the issues that each of these countries is facing and the debates and given the situation of public opinion and the government in each of the countries. So what we wanted to do in this seminar is to think together about what kind of policies would make sense for Latin America as a bloc to pursue. And this, I guess, has two parts. One that is substantive, like what are the policies that would really make sense to pursue? And the other one is a little more strategic or in terms of how do we get there? And I imagine that question is difficult, and it involves a lot of questions about international relations and about the ways in which Latin America can actually have some negotiating power. But we also want to rely on and advance the findings that we have based on a lot of research in different disciplines on what we already know that it's not working, and what are some of the ideas that we can propose, or what are the specific policies that we can identify that would make sense, especially taking into account similarities in the situations, the challenges, the opportunities that we see in these different countries. And so with this idea in mind, we invited speakers who know very well different countries that have very different challenges. Some produce a lot of substances and traffic them. Some are dealing more with trafficking. Some deal a lot with consumption, while others do not. And so the idea is to really rely on this comparison of cases to think more carefully about what are the policies that we should be looking for. So without any more background information, let's start. The idea is to start with a few questions to give listeners some idea of what is the situation in these different countries, and then we will jump into the specific discussion of the policies that would make sense to pursue. So let me start with one sort of very open question about the situation of what are the views in the countries that you study about drug policy reform or prohibition, at least. So is there a growing consciousness, if not consensus, which would be great, in the countries that you study that the current illicit drug law have not, well, the regimes have not been effective? So let's start with Angélica.
Well, thanks, Anna and Ken, for the invitation. I'll talk, I think, in very general terms about the region. And, as the conversation goes, maybe we can zoom in. I will say, so we, starting around 2009, 2010, I think we started to see a radical change in the conversation about drug policy in the region. Topics that were taboo to talk about before became much more open, and the conversation open. And I think there were a few reasons for that, like the trends and dynamics of violence in the region. The case of Mexico particularly, I think was kind of spark of thinking like, what's going on here? Why our policies against crime and drugs are not working and seem to be creating more violence. And then there was the famous report of the former Latin American presidents, the Latin American Commissions on Drugs and Democracy, which in my view kind of generated a cascade effect. This is not to say that drug policy discussions did not exist before, and a lot of people may have advocated for that before, but I do think 2009 became like a moment of change in the region where these discussions became much more mainstream, and many politicians actually became much more open to talk about it. I was hearing the other day, Iván Marolanda, who is a Colombian senator who has been talking about legalization now, and he himself talked about 20, 30 years ago, it was taboo. I will never think about talking about this. So that has changed radically. I think there was a lull in this conversation. So we had a peak for 2009, 2013, I will say 16, when the UN special session on drugs took place. And then we kind of went through a little I think the initial spark kind of lulled a little bit, and then we're seeing it again, the spark, and part of it is Petro in Colombia, and kind of he's reviving the conversation. Now, that doesn't mean that there is a consensus, and I think that's one of the issues. I think that what we're talking about when we talk about drug policy varies between countries. There is much more consensus in a way, I think, about cannabis regulations and drug use than there is about regulating other drugs like cocaine, heroin, and much less consensus about what an alternative regime for regulating production and distribution will mean. So there is certainly a much more space than there was before. And this also changes a lot between countries, right? So countries in the Southern Cone, Colombia, Mexico, Brazil, these conversations have been much more mainstream. We go to Central America, the topic still remains more or less taboo, talking about drug policy reform, and there is much more opposition. And there is also variations in public opinion, which we know we'll talk about. So, for the sake of conversation, I'll stop there and I'll let my colleagues jump into.
Great. Thank you, Angélica. Thiago?
Well, first of all, thank you, Anna and Ken, for the invitation. And it is very important to tackle these issues. And unfortunately, I'm here to talk about my country, Brazil. And it is not a very beautiful picture when the issue is drug policy. Brazil is a very conservative country, and of course, drugs and consumption and trafficking are major concerns of our society. But in general, the consensus, or more or less the consensus, is on the repressive and prohibitionist side. We had some advancements in the last 20 years, but they weren't linear or progressive in a very straightforward way. Under Lula, of course, Lula has won again. He's coming for a third term as president. But the current drug law in Brazil was approved in 2006 under Lula's first term. And it is a very complicated legislation and ambiguous in terms of consumption and repression. So when you talk about the drugs and drug policy in Brazil, I think we need to go to the basics. We're not talking about legalization. We're not talking about open policies on harm reduction. We need to talk about justice reform and police reform. It's more basic than we can when we're talking about other Latin American countries, as Colombia, for example, or even Argentina, or maybe in a way Mexico. We are in a different level. I think in a more initial level, because you need to tackle and to attack basic problems related to justice and police, because drug trafficking and the repression, the war on drugs in Brazil is a central piece of a more complex structure of social controlling by repression. So it is not easy to discuss this topic, because we have two different levels. In one hand, we have the moral consensus, the values that are very conservative, in a way, more than conservative, they are reactionary. A substantive part of the Brazilian society wants to go back in time to a more conservative past time. And on the other hand, we have a very concrete issue, a very concrete problem, which is the justice reform and police reform as an issue of citizenship. That's why I'm saying that we need to go to the basics in Brazil. We have a more elemental discussion here, dealing when we need to deal with citizenship, the right of having rights. For most of our population, and our population that is directly connected to the war on drugs. People from slums, people from favelas, people that are connected to organized crime, and mainly people who are targeted by our current drug laws and our current public security policies. So I think to summarize my first intervention, I would say that, of course, right now we have more conscience about this topic, and we have a lot of nowadays in comparison to 20 years ago, when we were a few researching and talking about drug policies in Brazil. Of course, we have a more optimistic scenario, but in terms of public policy and public discussion and public opinion, the situation is very complex.
Thank you, Thiago. Javier, your turn.
Good morning again. Thank you very much, Anna and Ken. And it's a pleasure to also be sharing this space with Angélica and Thiago. I think to try to understand the level of consensus, we need to first ask among whom, right? If we're talking about public opinion or government officials, because I think, unfortunately, we don't have the same kind of debate or space for discussion in different levels. At the public opinion level, I think, as Angélica mentioned, there's like an increasing awareness of the population of the negative consequences of the war on drugs and the criminalization aspects of it. And a lot of people will be seeing the benefits of that. There's like a few public opinion polls in Mexico, Colombia, where there's increasing openness from the population, broadly speaking, about having some considerations of legalizing different types of drugs or different types of policy approaches or alternatives that could be not so punitive or harmful to the population in general. To a certain extent, I mean, the latest numbers I saw in Mexico was like 67%. The majority of the population is open to consider alternatives to the war on drugs. and to decriminalizing drugs, particularly marijuana. The debate on other types of drugs is not so high, right? I'm talking about methamphetamine, cocaine, opioids, or other synthetic drugs. There's a lot more resistance from the population. I don't think there's that much openness and consensus about what alternatives are out there for non-marijuana related drugs. And part of that is also very important sector of the population, as Thiago mentioned, that is more conservative on the ideological spectrum. And also there's a lot of stigma generalized across the population. Not only for users, but also for the fear that legalizing these illicit markets will create a wave of insecurity, violence, that people will just go crazy on drugs and start committing crimes. That stigma is not supported by research. It's just like a perception, but it's a very powerful one that I think is preventing a more reasonable evidence-based debate. Which will require higher degrees of sophistication and knowledge than most of the population have, which is mostly relies on cues. So I think at the population, broad population level, there's increasing space for discussion, maybe increasing leniency towards non-punitive approaches to drugs, but still we have some very important breaks related to stigma and conservative points of view. And many countries in Latin America have a conservative agenda. I mean, that's a reality of the distribution of preferences among the population. So that is one of the consensus that I don't think there's, the consensus is still on the, let's not open up these markets. Not yet, but there's increasing debate or openness to discuss it. But I don't think that is the case among government agencies. Right, or government representatives or presidents who are kind of leading the way or discussions in Congress. We have just a few countries in Latin America that have had like more substantive policy changes in place as a national vision that gets backed up in the legal framework. Those are pretty much the anomaly. The vast majority still is on the criminalized side. It's not really having serious policy experimentations or considerations in place. Some countries have hinted that maybe we will start discussing this, but again, the vast majority of the gravitational pull is still around the criminalization of drug markets on the broad variety of substances that we have. Maybe the conversation is starting to open a little bit on the marijuana side, but we have many other problems with many other drugs that are a lot more problematic, and the conversation is not really considered there. In general, from a hemispheric point of view, I think that is because the gravitational core of this global policy is the US, right? And many countries gravitate around the US not only because of the drug policies they have in mind, but mostly economic dependence and political relationship. So there are like so many things at stake that as long as the US is not moving, many countries will still gravitate around that. The criminalized view and approach generally, legally, and also in terms of law enforcement against drugs. So probably not very optimistic on this front.
Thank you very much. So some of you, and especially Thiago and Javier, already mentioned a little bit what is the sense of public opinion right now, but I wanted to give you all a chance to say a little bit more about this if you have a sense or if you have information. Is there a sense of how much support there is for at least legalizing cannabis, marijuana? And do you have any sense of what drives this division? And I know there is no data on most countries on public opinion. It's really hard to know, especially data that we can use to compare different countries in Latin America. But do you have any sense of the different countries? And I also wanted to ask you about Central America in particular, because we have heard a lot about Colombia, Mexico, and Brazil. And what is your sense about Central America? So let's start with Javier now.
Right. Let me start with Central America. Central America, I mean, it's a very, especially the Northern Triangle, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. They live in incredibly difficult conditions. They suffer a lot of the negative consequences of international drug policies. So they suffer a lot of violence, and criminal organizations are very active at the local level with very predatory aspects. So that creates in the population a daily experience of the negative consequences of the war on drugs and all the problems associated with the high income that these drugs represent in communities that are ravaged by poverty. So that is a reality in many places. But at the same time, Central America, these three countries in the Northern Triangle, they have a very conservative approach in many aspects, not only with respect to drugs, but also with politics, gender, religion, Catholic and evangelical. They're like very core parts of the tissue and the weaving of society and politics. So there's a lot of resistance about opening up the conversation, despite having daily experiences with the negative consequences of criminalizing drugs. So unfortunately, I think for Central America, we're like far deeper into the punitive approach that is dominating the general perception, and politicians really catch up on that. We don't have very aggressive or open debates about decriminalizing drugs, because in many ways that reflects the preferences of the population. Again, in this very dysfunctional or dystopian world where we see the negative consequences of what happens, but still we're not willing to move. And all of that, I think, is lack of serious leadership in terms of probably open civil society. It's hard to have the voice and the space to lead the conversation from the civil society in these countries with these more, what we consider radical approaches in terms of drug policy. So I think there will be a lot of resistance. We don't have sufficient capacity of organizations speaking up, and there's like not enough forum or open discussion forums to consider these policies more seriously.
Perfect, thank you. Angélica?
So I agree with everything that Thiago and Javier have said about public opinion. I would like to add a few more things. So first of all, I think that in general, the majority of the populations for the region as an average seems to be more inclined towards against full legalization. That varies a lot between countries. As Javier just said, Central America has some of the lowest levels of public approval. Bolivia also has low levels of public approval for those policies, whereas the Southern Cone, Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, then Colombia, Mexico is where you see kind of high levels of public opinion. The interesting thing, and I will put this as a caveat, and I'm happy to, is like the policies that we've seen have passed. So I think public opinion is crucial. And I think that's one of the big challenges that we as scholars and politicians need to think about. But so far, the policies that have passed even against public opinion. And the biggest example is Uruguay. When Uruguay passed marijuana legalization, the majority of the population still opposed the measure. Now, if anything, probably the population of Uruguay was the more prone to be swayed towards approving it. But there is another interesting example, which is Paraguay, which is a very, very, very highly conservative country, where only about 10% of the population support marijuana legalization or drug legalization if we follow. So there are a few public opinion surveys for the entire region. One is Latinobarometro, did include this question in 2015, and the LAPOP has included in different years for different countries. But if we take Latinobarometro, which is the one that I think surveyed all the population at the same time in 2015. With those numbers, Paraguay appeared having very low levels, and Paraguay still approved American marijuana regulation, still limited with limitations, but it's not something that you will have expected in a country as conservative as Paraguay. And I think there are a few reasons for that. Was basically, I think certain groups, especially for medical marijuana, have become very mobilized, and there are organizations like Mama Cultiva that have operated across borders and across countries and can mobilize public opinion. So public opinion is important, but it's less important, let's say, than in the US, where these reforms pass through initiatives and public initiatives where people vote on these things. If we were to put some measures against voting, like probably it will not pass in any country. But there is a lot of top-down reform in Latin America. So that's something that it's important to keep in mind. But then I think that there are a lot of caveats in between countries. So Bolivia, for example, is interesting to me because in Bolivia, there is a strong support for, of course, legalizing coca leaves and the legal production of coca, but there is a strong opposition to more flexible regulations on drug consumption and drug use. So they are much more open to regulating production and distribution than they are about the use of drugs. And across different countries like the Southern Cone and Colombia, again, you will see higher levels of support for, depending on how you ask these questions, right? But more support for decriminalizing possession or depenalizing possession and use, or reducing the criminalization of certain aspects of the drug chain, but still very much opposition to say like full legalization. So like public opinion, but I think this also gets to another point, which is how these reforms are framed matters, and there are some framings that are more successful than others. And of course, the health framing is always much more successful in swaying public opinion, but the health framing works much better for use than it works for production and distribution, for changing or for proposing reforms around distribution and production. So that's another thing to keep in mind. And in terms of what we know about the determinants of public opinion, they are not as surprising. I think that we know age, education, are like religious, like right now religion is a major thing. There is, I think, especially among conservative sectors, there is a revival of religious affiliation as an important determinant of preferences for many things in general, but for drug legalization or even like I think security policies. So those are some, but what I think is interesting is that still this is all embedded between different countries' traditions. And as Javier was saying, with the case of Central America, countries have different traditions and different, I will say, tendencies of what public opinion is about. And the last thing we say is that I think a lot of the perception in the way that you can potentially sway public opinion around these topics has to do with something that Thiago mentioned before, which is people are unlikely to trust our government to regulate this well when they see high levels of corruption, high levels of repression by the police. So I think that those things seem to interact. There is a recent study that found trust in institutions and like perceptions about levels of health problems affecting the public opinion of legislators in Latin America about drug legalization. So these things kind of interact with perceptions about institutions, I think, to determine how open people will be to change some or not. But the one thing I think is important also is that a lot of the discussion about drug policy reform, I think, is very elite. And I think that's something that we need to really keep in mind.
Thank you. Thiago.
Well, despite of the efforts from Bolsonaro administration to disrupt the mechanisms for statistic studies during his term, we do have some data, and the data is interesting. For example, we have a poll, a 2021 survey on marijuana and medical cannabis, and 70% of the Brazilians then last year were pro or for the legalization of cannabis for medical purposes. And more or less the same numbers, 67% were against the legalization of the other drugs and of cannabis for recreational use. So you have a more or less established in Brazil a type of on public opinion, and as well with some decisions from our Supreme Court that I have been given a space and a legal basis for the medical use of cannabis. And it was something that began with a type of social movement an organization of parents of children with neurological problems, severe diseases, and they were fighting for the right of using CBD products to face this type of problems and this type of diseases, and they got the first permissions to import CBD products to treat their children, and it opened a door for other decisions from the Supreme Court. But they are all disconnected. They haven't made a corpus, a legal corpus, with some consistency. So we have a moral consent for medical use that goes hand in hand with the moral consensus against any type of recreational use. So I think it is a good example how things are in Brazil. And the medical issue, the medical argument, the medical basis to support the use of cannabis, for example, is based on a conservative approach. First, the right of suffering children to have a treatment, and later the issue that if the components of cannabis that don't have psychoactive properties could be tolerated and could be allowed, but the issue of the psychoactive matter, the psychoactive question, is still on the more conservative side of the agenda. So for medical purposes, I think we have an avenue to talk about drug policies in Brazil. But when the topic is not the medical use, but the recreational use or the use that are concerned to individual rights, etc., there's no path at all for a major discussion outside minor circles of intellectuals and advocacy groups that are very restrict and isolated in the current scenario in Brazil.
Thank you. Ken, do you have a question before we turn to places?
I have a couple of questions, and then Angélica said something that stopped me right in my tracks, which I want to come back to when I can articulate these other questions. But Angélica said something about, and to a certain extent, we're involved in a conversation among elites, or it's an elite conversation. I think if I heard Angélica right on that. So I really want to probe a little bit about what she meant by that, because the way the issue gets framed, certainly, let's just take Colombia, for example, is it's not the elites per se who are getting so badly impacted by the current regime, but in fact the campesinos and those poor kids along the way, or not so poor kids, whatever, who were involved in the chain of the whole drug chain. So I want to put that out there, but just hold off on that for 1 second. And I wanted to come back to the examples of Uruguay and Paraguay, which sounded to me like examples of political will on behalf of the government or the leaders at the time to push something through that they thought was correct, for whatever reasons that they, and this is just cannabis, of course, we're talking about. In Colombia, in other places, we're talking about full-on legalization or regularization for all drugs. But we'll scale it back. But you have the political will in Paraguay and Uruguay that pushed it forward. And I ask myself, how many people in the government of Brazil, and the people, or the incoming government, at least of Brazil, or in Mexico, can look at the situations in their countries and not realize that it's been a disaster in so many, and getting worse because of the drug situation. So I guess the question is, let's go to the political will. Let's go to Mexico and Brazil. Is there real, if you have private conversations with people in the government who understand the impacts of what's going on and see it every day, is there not some acknowledgement that in fact this has been a disaster and a change needs to happen, but they don't have the political will to do it for all the reasons of the popular pushback that you all have just described? So maybe Thiago, let me start with you, and then maybe Javier, you could come in and talk about Mexico. But Thiago, there must be some recognition in the, at least in the government, in Lula himself and the people he would be bringing around, that this can't go on this way. That a massive change needs to be made. No, or am I just projecting?
No, Ken, I think you're right. There is an awareness of the problem, but I'll give you an example. In 2017, I finished a report funded by the Minister of Defense, a Brazilian Minister of Defense, on the militarization of the war on drugs in Brazil. They asked me to do to make a report on the in a comparative way with Colombia and Mexico, to see to show the effects on the military of the deployment of the military against drug cartels, etc. And I did the work, and I presented it to a very high level panel in Brasilia, with some generals and some civilians from the Ministry of Defense and some high figures. Back then, it was the Michel Temer's administration. And one of them, after my presentation, I told them the more or less the story of the effects of militarization in Mexico and in Colombia, and the recent story of the militarization in Brazil. Because we have a very complex thing in Brazil, because the police are militarized, but not the military. They weren't engaged in public safety. But since 2010, 2011, they became more and more present in Rio de Janeiro, mainly occupying favelas and other things justified by the drug war and the war against the organized crime. So I finished the presentation, and this figure, this major person of the Temer's administration, approached me and said, "Well, Professor, congratulations for the presentation. We think you are right, but we were not elected to do so." So he was very sincere, I think, and transparent. Now he recognized the effects, the very complicated and evil effects of militarization on the forces and for society, but he told me openly and bluntly that the government, the administration, they weren't there to do so. They were there to militarize everything. So I think, of course, it is a single example, but I think it's very illustrative of how things are in Brazil. There is a conscience of the effects on the forces, on police, and on the military, and they are deleterious effects. But they don't have the political support from the population in general. And to wrap it up, I would say the drug policy issue wasn't an issue at all during this presidential campaign. Lula didn't mention it. Bolsonaro didn't mention it. Even to say that he will be more and more repressive, it didn't came up. It didn't come up because it is something that nobody wants to deal with, because it takes votes. It takes votes. The political cost to talk about drugs in Brazil is so high that nobody wants to talk about it. And I think that is more or less the temperature of the discussion when you talk about drug policies right now, even considering that the Works Party, Lula's party, was in the 90s and the early 21st century, the first political party in Brazil to introduce things like harm reduction in Brazil. And it's true. And we can expect they will try to do this again. But there is a lot of there is a huge wall to overcome in terms of prejudice, and the political destruction in terms of the state bureaucracy during the two latest administration, Temer and Bolsonaro. There are many things to be rebuilt. And so Lula is not getting the right now from the point he left in 2010. Right now he's going to face a very complicated situation, difficult situation, worse than he left the Brazil that he left in 2010.
Yeah, thank you, Thiago. It's so interesting the distinction in Colombia, where you had two ex-presidents who were rapidly enforced the laws, and their generals, who were the ones who were some of the biggest proponents for complete legalization, right? Santos Gaviria and General Naranjo and others, who were sort of leading all that and say, we don't want to be part of it. The same thing in Canada with the cannabis. The mounted police are in charge of enforcing the cannabis law, said, we want legalization. We don't, this is not what we do. We want to be part of this. Javier, to switch to Mexico for a second, if I'm not mistaken, Morena is the one that's been pushing through the cannabis legislation in Congress in Mexico. Is there sort of an acknowledgement that they would like to do more, or the fact of the matter is it is a disaster and things have to be overhauled, but it's just a question of political will and nobody has it, or am I assuming too much on their behalf?
Yeah, it's a disaster. I would say it's more precisely, it's a contradiction. Right? A contradiction between the rhetoric and the government actions. Right? The rhetoric, since López Obrador, the current president, was campaigning, he proposed, I mean, he's really good with managing public opinion. So he proposed this idea of abrazos no balazos, hugs instead of bullets. And that really caught on a lot of the population. And basically two key components, well, two really key components there was, maybe we can talk a little about that later, trying to implement alternative cultivation, right? Those who are cultivating drugs, let's try to find some alternative crops so they could make a living on the legal sector without engaging on that. Nothing has been done on that front at all. That's just like something that he campaigned on, but they haven't enacted anything with respect to these alternative cultivation policies when he stepped into office. And the other one was to pull the military back to the barrels, take them out of the streets and put them back in the cartel barracks. And we saw the complete opposite, right? In terms of the rhetoric is going into harm reduction, but all the militarization efforts are full swing, actually enhanced and expanded. So this is a contradiction and the dissonance. At the party level, there are some discussions from Morena that have faced a lot of resistance, not only from the opposition parties, which is not that much opposition anyway, but also internally within the party, again, with this heavy weight of stigma that prevents the conversation to move forward. A little bit more has been done at the local level with some states trying to decriminalize at least medical and to some extent some recreational consumption to small levels. But overall, the discussion in Mexico is not generally at the government level moving towards the decriminalization and harm reduction and more public health approaches that could be highly beneficial. Unfortunately, the discussion is a lot more thin air, where on the other side, the government actions are the complete opposite. Probably the biggest example is it's not only the militarization, but what is Mexico has been labeled as militarism, which is the army is not only in charge of fighting drugs, but now they're in charge of taking over many civilian actions. They're building infrastructure, they're taking care of or managing airports and ports, like which are strategic points of entry. A lot of that was because of the high levels of corruption of civilian authorities managing those aspects. But that gave the army a lot of power beyond their initial mandate of national protection or national security, but also domestic law enforcement. That has played out in several power moves that the military has made against the government or justice apparatus, with scandals related to the disappearance of students, for example, that military personnel were involved, and you have the high generals calling the president to say, you know what, those guys, just take them out of prison. They're fine. They will be fine. So that really shows how much weight the military has in Mexico beyond just law enforcement, how much they have a very strong grip on the government that is not likely to move in the direction of more liberal drug policies in the country.
Yeah, definitely a change in the civilian military dynamic in Mexico going on, which is a really good point, how that impacts this whole conversation, which it certainly might not have had impacted only a few years ago. Angélica, I did want to come back to that point you made. I'm not sure that we should do with it now, because I know we want to get into the actual title of the conference. This thing was points of convergence. So maybe if we could hold that point in abeyance about the elite aspect, or just to get clarification on that. And maybe if I could switch what I was going to ask and then turn it over to Ana, is the one country we haven't mentioned at all was Peru, right? Peru sits in a geographically very interesting conversation. Demographically, one might think a bit like Bolivia and sort of Colombia. I mean, obviously that's in a gross sort of general kind of way, but the history of coca in Peru and the like. Does anybody want to touch a little bit on what's going on in Peru in this with respect to these issues?
So my perception about Peru, and I will make it very clear that it's not one of the countries that I've been looking at in more detail. So I think Peru, unlike other countries like Colombia or Ecuador, like surrounding it, the conversation of drug policy hasn't made it to the top of policy agendas. And I feel that part of it has to do with the own political circumstances of Peru, like and the instability of the last few years, where so many other things. It's not that the discussions don't exist, but I think they have been much less prominent, precisely because there are issues that have been kind of more at the top of the agenda. And I think in general, actually, that's one thing that happens, right? Like you may have people, we were talking just about political will, and if I just may add quickly to what Javier and Thiago were saying, is that I think you need political will in certain sectors, but the conditions of the party system and the political conditions of the countries also determine how that plays out. And I think that's partially what has happened in Peru. And Peru, like, it's just been in a constant state of disarray in the past few years, where so many other things, I think, are going on, where this is not necessarily the thing that's at the top of the agenda. Peru does have, I think, a discussion alongside Colombia and Bolivia about regulating coca and legal uses of coca, and has a tradition with that with alternative development. But the other parts of the discussion, I think, have been less muted. And if they exist, and again, I kind of declare openly, I may not know as much, and there may be things I'm hearing, but as I said, I don't think it's as prominent outside of Peru for the reasons I just mentioned. So that's my reaction to that question.
Thank you. I know, Thiago, Javier, did you want to add it to that, or should we move on?
I just would like to extend a little bit, not just to Peru, but the neighboring country, like Bolivia. It's a key. Drug policy in Bolivia is very interesting. I think that's an overlooked model, particularly when we move on to the conversation in terms of production. The CATO system, the government decriminalized the production, and they actually regulate a lot of the production in the legal areas, and they still eradicate production in illegal areas, right? And they have a very interesting system there, which I think is something that should pay a little more attention, of transferring the incentives of who polices this is not necessarily the government. They still have their eradication unit, but a lot of the policing or the control, the management of how much coca is being produced is at the organizational level. Right? The government gives these licenses for communities or cooperatives to produce. And if they exceed the limit of production, that means that some of the production is going not to the legal market, then get fines and eventually they cool their license. So it's in the interest of the producers themselves to regulate themselves. I think that's something very interesting that we should pay attention, which is not just the leadership, the national level policies, but how these policies eventually get implemented in a way that flip the system of incentives in favor to producers to keep in line with drug production, well, coca cultivation in Bolivia. So I think that is something to command in general for the Andean region.
I would like to add something just to make a point here. I think we need to pay attention to the geopolitical and the geoeconomical gravitational center of the drug trafficking economy in the Americas, because when we saw a movement from a displacement from Peru and Bolivia toward Colombia, and later toward Colombia and Mexico, and even to Brazil, we think that we can see that there are differences, very important differences, and some avenues for change can appear because the country has been facing transformation on the relationship between its inner or its local economy and the international economy or international illegal economy of drugs. So since the 90s, the displacement of the center, the major center in Latin America for the illegal drug economy from Peru and Bolivia toward Colombia, and Colombia toward Mexico, and the appearance of Brazil as a side country, and with its very big and well organized illegal groups, organized crime. I think this displacement makes a point, and we need to pay attention to it in order to think how, including how different drug policies can be pushed forward when the country wins or it loses importance in the geopolitical environment of the drug economy.
Thank you. Okay, and this discussion that Javier started about the Bolivian model of social control is a good bridge to get into our next set of questions, which are about the policies that you think would make sense for Latin America as a bloc. So we have 37 minutes. And we have like 4 areas, but I know they are not equally important for the region as a whole. So let's start with production, which matters for a few regions, not for all the regions, as trafficking and consumption probably do. But so what are your takes on, what is your take on the kind of policies that would make sense, not just for one country, but for several countries in terms of production? And maybe we can start with Javier, since you already mentioned the Bolivian model. And I wanted to mention, there is CESED from Los Andes, Maria Alejandra Vélez wrote a report on the social control model in Bolivia and how we could learn from it. It's on their website. Maybe it's useful for anyone who's more interested in that. Go ahead, Javier.
Thank you very much, Anna. Yeah, production is a key problem for Latin America, given our geographic location and environmental conditions and geographic conditions. But I think we need to break down the conversation between production of what, right? Coca production, that's very concentrated in some parts of Latin America. Marijuana production, probably not necessarily, maybe it's a little more scattered, or maybe Mexico plays and also another important role in terms of the consumption market in the US. But we also have production of synthetic drugs, right? And the policies for those could be definitely different. In terms of the agricultural kind of production, so not the synthetic one, coca and marijuana, and maybe a little bit of poppy in Mexico, I think alternative development is a key successful or policy that has the potential of being highly successful if all the different components are in line. And those different components is not only to provide subsidies or incentives or economic compensations for producers or farmers to cultivate other things, pineapples, nuts, whatever, instead of illicit crops, but everything else that should come with a business plan. We generally lack those. First of all, support from government agencies usually is late, highly bureaucratic, arrives late. People need to eat now, and to eat now, you need to plant your seeds like 6 months ahead. So the political economy and the timing of production is not always or rarely in line with what government agencies are ready to implement to really support effective alternative development policies. Another one is the sustainability of these policies. With the wings of change of government agencies and political instability, there's always the risk of the next government just in 3 or 6 years or 4, depending on the country, just wiping out these subsidies or these alternative development plans. And that will just leave peasants, again, in highly vulnerable population conditions. And that will, the strategic thinking of how reliable the government is to keep doing this for 3-5 years will determine what peasants do now. In addition to the immediate support of cultivation, we need to consider all the chains, economic chains associated with not only producing, again, pineapples or nuts or whatever, but also commercialization. You could grow a lot of pineapples and you don't have access to the markets, meaning roads and commercialization, marketing, accounting, connections to sell points, then all those pineapples are going to end up rotting in your jar, or you will have to sell them to very low prices. So there's a lot of economic complexity that should go hand in hand with effective alternative development plans, which are rarely put in place. And that speaks not only to the policies and the funds that you might have available, but also the government capacity to implement those policies effectively. So I think there's great promise if done properly and carefully in the long term. These have to be sustained efforts. Unfortunately, we don't see much of that institutional effort sustained over time with the right type of implementation agencies and strategies.
Yeah. And on top of that, because governments are failing so often to fulfill their promises, then trust in governments and in substitution programs or crop substitution programs goes down in every country that tries it. No? So you have this effect in the long term of just people not believing the government and any of these projects. Thank you, Javier. Thiago.
I think Javier has a very good point, because crop substitution itself will never work when you have the other alternative, the legal one, is so profitable. So I think we have to think about crop substitution. We need to go towards what Javier was mentioning, the offering not only of seeds of beans or corn, but the whole chain, the economic chain and infrastructure necessary to make it profitable. On the other hand, to make it profitable, infrastructure and financial support, etc., is not enough. I think it needs to be accompanied by at least, not if legalization of the nowadays illegal drugs, but at least decriminalization, because we need to make the illegal economy less interesting. Because we always, in general, we forget that people that are involved with an illegal economy are rational as well. They need to survive. They are in very difficult situation, economic situation, isolation. They are fighting for their survival. And they are, if we were in their situation, probably we will consider getting into a very dangerous but more profitable activity, and because it is a rational choice to do. We need to have children to feed. We need to survive in a very difficult world in very difficult countries. So if there isn't a credible substitution for illegal crops, they must be, in my opinion, followed or come together with a form of to decompress the profits from the illegal economy, and it means to destroy or disarray in a way the illegal economy itself. So crop substitution, okay, infrastructure, yeah, definitely, but of course it is necessary to change the relationship with the levels of profits from the legal economy and from the profits from the illegal economy. Otherwise, it will be only rhetoric and good intentions, and it's not connected to the real needs of the people.
Thank you, Thiago. And Angélica?
So I'll just add a few things. I agree with everything Javier and Thiago have said about alternative development. I think it's also important to understand that when you really look at the profits from coca cultivation, and we know this from Colombia, Bolivia, and Peru, they are not that high, but they are reliable. So any alternative economy has difficulty competing with that, just because the cycles of many other agricultural products are much shorter, much longer than that of coca, and much less reliable because of all the things that have said: infrastructure, access to markets, reliability of buyers. So alternative development in Colombia has a long history, Peru, like more or less, and Bolivia as well. And we have history of things that have worked and many others that haven't worked with alternative development. But we kind of know how to make it work. But it's just more than coming saying, change your, switch to other crops immediately on top of everything, right? Because that's how. Now, but if done properly, it can have an impact on reducing supply, right? And as Thiago was just saying, that doesn't eliminate the other market, the legal market, and the legal market that will always compete with those alternative policies. So what we have on the table, I think we have at least on the table possibilities, and that's where Colombia is leading right now and kind of following on Bolivia's footsteps, and Peru more or less. Colombia has never had a legal market for coca leaf, never. It's always been criminalized, and the one thing that can be open right now is open that market for legal coca leaf uses. And many organizations in Colombia are actually jumping on this, and they have proposals of how to, that many indigenous communities that have the potential to produce some legal coca products in Colombia have not been able to do it up to now because coca leaf production is criminalized. So there is a space to do that can have, I think, an impact on reducing the potential for coca leaf production that is that goes into the cocaine market. Bolivia, of course, in some ways is a successful case up to some level, right? If we see the data, we can see that since Bolivia implemented the Cato system, coca cultivation did decline, but it has caveats, right? And Thomas Grisafi, an anthropologist who has worked with coca producing communities in Bolivia, has found that first of all, that it has very difficult for the government of Bolivia to politically also maintain that line between, okay, this is coca leaf production for legal uses, but I'm not going to allow coca production that is going for illegal uses. And the Bolivian communities, for many different reasons, very legitimate, they say, if this is going to cocaine markets, we don't care. That's the problem of the US because they have a cocaine use. I don't think that's necessary. I think that's a very particular Bolivian dynamic because of the political mobilization of coca growers and many different reasons. The point I'm trying to make here is that even if we have these successful alternative development pockets, if we have a successful coca leaf market, we still have the issue that the cocaine market is not going away, right? And that's where I think our next challenge is. Can we think about pilot programs for legalizing some coca leaf for cocaine production? And I think we get to, another proposal that has been floated in Colombia, which I think has some merit and is worth considering, is that the government can buy, like for the government to buy all coca leaf production to avoid it being diverted for illegal purposes. I think, again, this has maybe some potential for reducing the supply of coca leaf that goes for cocaine. But again, as long as there is an illegal cocaine market, this is not going to disappear. And I think that remains being our main challenge. And that's why we need to think about this as regions, right? Because if we think it only as countries individually, then we're always going to run into the same issue. What happens if the incentives for the legal market are still there, which are much more profitable, much bigger? But I do think, with all that caveat, these policies that we talk about, like creating markets for legal coca leaf, starting to open markets for or think about better uses and better systems of alternative development, those things can have an impact on reducing supply. But still, we always go into that world. I think there is much more space to think about creating legal markets for marijuana and cannabis production. As Thiago was saying, I think that there is the support for medical cannabis has increased. That doesn't necessarily mean for recreational, but I think how the debate has changed, I see that as much more possible. And that's still a significant amount of illegal market, particularly for Colombia and for Paraguay as sources of this drug. So there may be something to be said about those countries for legalization potentially having an impact. Of course, we always have to think about all the caveats, potentially gray markets, how you regulate, tax, who controls production, all those things. For cocaine, I think that's more challenging. If we were ever to think about legalizing some level of cocaine production, the who will be the key question here, because we don't have, with poppies, or with heroin, with marijuana, now with medical cannabis, we have a set of legal actors that are engaged in the production of these drugs. We don't have that for cocaine, because we haven't had a legal market for cocaine ever, or well, very, very briefly. So I think that would be a key question if we were to think about like this extreme scenario. What if we thought about a small legal market for cocaine? But those are some of the things I think we will need to consider. And again, and just to briefly say, like when I was talking about the elite debate, but that I don't mean like, it's not necessarily that there are not marginalized communities that have been very active in these debates. They have, and you see these especially with producers of drugs, of plant-based drugs. However, I think it's elite to the extent that when we talk about production and drug trafficking, where the debate is much more about like how we know that drug policies haven't worked because the market hasn't increased, because we have extremely powerful drug, criminal actors. All those arguments are complex, and those are complex that we understand well in academia, maybe some policy sectors, but that I don't think the population like has the information or even goes in that direction. So I think, especially I think us as scholars and academics and policymakers, sometimes our arguments make a lot of sense to us. That doesn't necessarily mean that they make sense for the general population. And I think that relates mostly to when we think about production and distribution, because those are the harder to think about. Because I think one of the key reactions of people will be, well, if we legalize this, you mean you're legalizing all those criminal actors that are engaging in violence in our communities, right? And that's one reaction that people have towards this. So I think that's particularly the case when we talk about production and distribution.
Thank you, Angélica. So I wanted to add two things for people who may not know a lot about Colombia. And it's, as Angélica mentioned, it's very well established that coca growers don't make a lot of money. They are very poor. But I wanted to also add that one of the things that the illicit drugs market are able to do, that the infrastructure that the country has is not able to do, is to solve the problems of lack of infrastructure, roads, everything. So these criminal actors actually show up to the growers' farms or their land and buy the coca leaves or the paste or the coca paste, right? So it's the challenge of competing with this is just huge, because there is no licit economy where your buyer is going to go, show up all the way to your land that is up in the mountains, right? So it's the difference between the two is just very big. And I will also want to say that the idea of pilots is something that came up in our last seminar, and we can talk about that as well for trafficking. And one of the conclusions that the panelists had in that seminar is that if we think, for example, of legalizing cocaine, there are so many logistics and institutional challenges that it would be very good to first have like a learning experience with marijuana, right? And we do have some pilots for smaller things. Like in Colombia, there is one instance of legal production of coca leaves because the state gave a permission to this one community in the Cauca region. And then you do see products using coca leaves that are legal, and it's been working for a few years, right? So there are these pilots that we can learn from. Okay, so let's move on to trafficking. And Angélica already mentioned a couple of things. What are the policies that we can envision for the region? And every year there is one new country that is suffering with trafficking and violence associated with trafficking. So what are your thoughts? And we have just 20 minutes left. And we want to talk about consumption too. So I invite you to try to be concise. Let's start with Thiago for this one.
Yeah, well, it is a major concern in Brazil, and I think Brazil. I'm not sure if you are aware of that, but Brazil is one of the biggest incarcerated populations in the world. We have the most recent data shows that we have more or less 900,000 people in prisons, and our organized crime is a prison-born organized crime. We have more or less the same thing in Venezuela, in Colombia, but it's different from Mexico, for example. And it's that we have our organized crime, our drug trafficking has two legs. One leg, and the major one, is inside the prison system, and the other one is on the poor communities related to the same population, the population that come to one environment to another, and they are always changing. It's an interchangeable population from prison to favelas, from favelas to prison. And I think the first thing we should do is stop arresting minor drug offenders. It is a crucial thing in Brazil, because we have from this population 30%, 35% of men and 50 to 55% of women are nowadays in prison due to crimes related to drug trafficking. And the vast majority of them was convicted by minor offense. So I think to intercept the massive arresting, the mass incarceration of people from favelas and from very difficult socioeconomic backgrounds is a crucial thing to do, because in general, people are arrested and they become members of an organized group inside the prison system. Because here in Brazil, prisons are organized and separated by factions, by organized crime groups. So this prison is to Red Commando, Comando Vermelho. This prison is to another group. They divided the prison system in Brazil is divided among groups, different groups, and they control everything inside the prison, the facilities in general. So I think it is a crucial thing. And the second thing is a major intervention on public security, or the public security approach to drug trafficking, because we have a militarized approach by the police. We have a gendarmerie type of police, a militarized police, and as well the military themselves as I was talking previously. So I think drug trafficking in Brazil is a key country in the geoeconomic flux of illegal drugs from South America to Europe, especially. But Brazil is a major country for consumption itself, and the United Nations data since 2010, 2011 displays the Drug War Report displays Brazil as the second most important market for cocaine. The first one is the United States, and the second one is Brazil. So Brazil is not just a corridor for illegal drugs toward Africa, Asia, or Europe, or even the United States, but it is a market itself. So drug trafficking and consumption are, of course, strictly connected in Brazil. And I think that disrupting the organized crime in Brazil is a thing that has to do with disrupting the system that provides the energy and the food for organized crime, and it is the source for this energy is the prison system and the massive incarceration policies that Brazil has for 3 or 4 decades in force.
Thank you, Thiago. Javier?
I think from the Mexican perspective, the biggest challenge comes with the consequences of interdiction, right? Trying to interrupt trafficking. As we move farther along from production areas to drug trafficking to entry points in the US, the prices of drugs increase because the need to provide security, logistics, all the concealed compartments, boats, transportation. You need to bribe government officials to allow you pass drugs. So as drugs move along from production to destination points, the prices go up. This makes illicit drugs, when they reach the Mexican market, very valuable. So valuable that people are willing to kill and die for, right? And when you have government agencies disrupting drug trafficking, that creates a lot of dynamics of violence between criminal groups fighting the government for taking away so valuable products, but also ignites violence between criminal groups because it signals that, well, this group is no longer protected by the government, so let's further attack, so we wipe them out and we control this corridor or these storage facilities or production areas in Mexico. So that is a huge challenge of the consequences of cracking on drug trafficking routes and activities has lots of negative consequences related to violence, corruption to government agencies, and to the broader victimization of the population, because eventually some of these groups, when their income gets affected by drug trafficking, they keep their comparative advantage and then turn against the population in predatory manners to increase extortion, disappearances. They go after a wide variety of illicit markets to keep extracting rents from them to compensate the loss of drugs lost through interdiction and drug trafficking. So that is a huge problem that the Mexican government is facing as the consequence of cracking down on drugs with this militarist punitive approach that is creating a lot more problems than the solution that is trying to aim, especially because drug prices in the US have remained high. And now we have the additional entry of particularly fentanyl that has becoming a game changer. It's incredibly expensive, incredibly powerful, and very easy to traffic, right? With small pills, you can make a lot of money instead of having an entire truck full of packs of cocaine or marijuana. Just like smuggle a small bag in someone's backpack as they cross the border from Mexico to the US, and you can make a lot of money. So it's increasingly difficult to track and to disrupt networks of fentanyl, which are highly valuable, and with all the negative consequences that we see in Mexico. And another important point is the role that the US has on Mexican efforts of interdiction. It's known that the pressure of the US, for example, to crack down on fentanyl or methamphetamine is huge on Mexican government agencies. But that is not really a problem in Mexico. I mean, people do not really consume fentanyl or synthetic drugs. We have very low prevalence of marijuana, which is the most used drug, which is like probably, it's hard to know, but 4 to 6%. Cocaine is even lower than that, and other drugs are like pretty much very, very rare. They're an anomaly. Nevertheless, the pressure of the US government, on the Mexican government to crack down on producers of methamphetamine and fentanyl ignites problems of violence in Mexico when those drugs are not a problem in Mexico. So pretty much the US is outsourcing this crackdown on the Mexican government, and Mexican population is suffering the negative consequences of those crackdowns. So there are lots of problems associated with the high value of drugs as they reach Mexico as the entry point to the big market of the US, that the consequences of interdiction of drug trafficking has very negative side effects on the Mexican population.
Okay, that just to jump in for a second, that was exactly the point that former President Zedillo was making a couple of days ago in a major conference in Bogota. And not only that, the point that he makes is the US approach actually then aided and abetted the creation of mafia in the US to distribute the illegal fentanyl and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it was, another example of complete backfiring. Was there anybody else, Anna, that we wanted to was going to jump in on this issue?
No, well, yes, sorry. We have Angélica now, and then we moved. So we're not going to talk about consumption because we're running out of time, but let's go to Angélica, and then we'll come back to and maybe Angélica, you can start with that as well. So you talk about trafficking, and then whether you see this collaboration among Latin American countries as a priority right now or not, and whether it's feasible. And then we'll go back to Javier and Thiago, and we'll end there. Thank you.
So I will just add to the trafficking that I think the biggest challenge with trafficking is that, so we know all these things that haven't worked, right? And we know that interdiction, that repression, incarceration have been part of the reason why we see, highly organized, powerful trafficking organizations. And I think the biggest challenge is that once those organizations have emerged and start creating and controlling territories, it's very difficult to put the genie back in the bottle, right? And I think that's the main challenge for Latin American countries. That's the case for Colombia, for Mexico, for Brazil. I think that one of the things we know, apart from avoiding those policies that we know haven't worked, and try to use much more targeted and well-planned operations, and by well-planned, I mean not only well-planned strategically, but considering political conditions in the different locations. But I think there needs to be much more emphasis in really good intelligence and dismantling networks, which has never been really the case. Like the emphasis is like incarcerating drug lords or incarcerating low levels of small-time drug offenders, and there is very little of dismantling the actual networks. When there has been some success in dismantling networks, not only through repression, but through justice, that's where we've seen, we have the case of Guatemala with the CICIG that seems to, with limitations, but there is some, and this is not exactly the trafficking, but I think it's a good example of how can you really try to tackle networks by considering not only the actual criminal actors, but the politicians, all the members of those of the illicit change that operate. That can be much more effective than just indiscriminate incarceration, indiscriminate targeting. And then, so that's kind of, it requires, and then the other thing is that, again, another challenge we have is that these markets are transnational, but the way that transnational cooperation, in my view, has been understood so far is not the right one, right? And also there is always, so when we talk about transnational organized crime right now in the region, for example, you will say oh, the Mexicans are operating across the region, or the Brazilians and the PCC are moving everywhere, and it was before Colombia, right? But without really understanding how these networks operate, and without separating clearly the roles. So transnational markets, of course, need the presence of trafficking actors everywhere along the trafficking chain. That doesn't necessarily mean that these groups are actually operating in different areas. So I think a lot of what transnational cooperation requires is a much more nuanced understanding of how these transnational networks operate, and how basically separating the fact that you need transnational connections, but that many of these organizations operate locally and have very, very deep impacts on the communities where they operate. So I think there are different levels there. I think there is also space to think about different justice forms and alternatives to address different aspects. So not just, so as I said, dismantling networks, but also thinking about restorative justice, transitional justice, all like start implementing some of those things. So thinking about how applying those to drug trafficking can help us go deeper than just incarcerating the people that are engaged in these markets. But at the same time, I think we, sometimes this is hard, but like these networks are incredibly complex, right? So we also need to think in tandem about what we do with the networks and what we do with the people who survive in these economies, which is a lot of money, a lot of people. And then I will say, just when we're thinking about the cooperation, so I think here in Thiago today, I'm much less optimistic, because I was thinking with Colombia and Brazil, for example, you have, when we're thinking about pilot programs, having Lula government, having Petro government, there could be a space to create a pilot government where you try to, a pilot program where you try to think about addressing some of these aspects that are more transnational than local. And kind of at least just starting this process of brainstorming, okay, how do we think about the implications of, what will it mean if Colombia creates a pilot project for recreational marijuana, and how that market can impact Brazil, and what kind of those aspects. And I'm thinking about Brazil just because I see that alliance much more clear than others in the region. I don't think, for example, the Petro López Obrador is as clear, partially because of the reasons that Javier just mentioned. Bolivia and Colombia, there are some possibilities there, I think, but as I was saying before, I think Bolivia remains, their focus is really legal coca uses through the communities that have traditionally produced coca. And I think that creates some limitations for thinking about broader policies about drug legalization or drug regulation. But I think there is more space, I think, but I think that what will be really interesting if there was a chance of creating a pilot program that is more than a country-based initiative, and we're like at least thinking about some of these connections and how markets operate across borders, and try to tackle that through, if not a massive legalization process, something that is more like small and bounded.
Thank you. We have just a couple of minutes, so if you want to share your thoughts on the cooperation issue, we'll go to Javier first and then Thiago.
Well, that's a very hard one. I don't think there's, in order to have cooperation among countries to address the transnational aspects, that's where we face a lot of difficulties, bureaucratic intelligence sharing, different regulations. So the prospects of having a coordinated transnational effort to crack down on very fluid, dynamic, smart, clever drug trafficking networks, that is very hard. I've been some conversations with the UN where they invite government agencies, and they all want to cooperate, but when they go down to the formal channels of cooperation, you have to send a letter, the ministers have to approve it. By the time you get through the bureaucracy to start enacting some information sharing that is going to happen, these shipment is going to arrive from Colombia to Honduras or Venezuela or all the way to Mexico. By the time you clear all the bureaucratic steps, those guys are already in New York. So that is a huge coordination problem that is going to be very hard to coordinate in order to crack down on these illicit markets transnationally. And I know we are short on time, so I'm just going to leave my comment there.
Thank you, Javier. Thiago?
Well, I think to put it in just a few words, I think that Colombia and Mexico have more to share with Brazil than other countries, just like the Uruguayan experience, for example, because Uruguay is a 4 million people country, and 4 million is half the population of Rio de Janeiro itself. So I think that it's one major question. And the other major question is that Colombia and Mexico, in my opinion, have something in common. They they have reached a very complicated and disruptive level of violence connected to illegal drugs economy. And they are facing, in a way, differently, the consequences of it and trying to overcome policies that had led to this situation. I think we can differently build some pilot projects with Colombia, taking advantage of this, the current political alignment between Petro and Lula, but also with Mexico in terms of best or worst practices, in terms of the deployment of the military and the arrangements on police and justice reform. So I think that the two Latin American countries that are most important to Brazil in terms of cooperation and sharing experiences are precisely Colombia and Mexico.
Thank you very much, Thiago. So thank you, everyone. It's now time to end and to let our audience leave. There are so many topics we didn't get to everything, and there were a couple of questions from the audience, and unfortunately, we just don't have the time to get to them. But thank you again to our panelists for joining us. And we will continue to think about drug policy in Latin America together with, again, this collaboration between the Canadian Council for the Americas and Redesdal, the Network on the Studies of Drugs in Latin America, and Northwestern University. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.